And Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and welcome to our Shabbat service at Bet Ariel. Today's parasha is called Terumah, and it covers Exodus chapter 25 to 27. Terumah means an offering, not sacrifice offerings as we know it, but those needed to build the Mishkan, that is the tabernacle where God was to dwell with the Israelites. So these contributions or offerings were to come from the heart, as Moses opens up the text with an invitation to all in Israel whose heart, he says, was moved to bring his or her gifts. And this is the first time the Hebrew word terumah appears in the scriptures, and it's mentioned, sets a timeless precedence. It's an invitation for everyone to freely come, join the work in raising and proclaiming the name of God. In these 3 chapters, we're brought to see some selected items from the Mishkan. We go from the Holy of Holies to the holy place, then to the courts, along with all its colorful curtains shrouding the Mishkan. Together, these items brings us to journey through the history of redemption from the altar of sacrifice as you enter the perimeter right to the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. Here, in every aspect of the Mishkan, actually the Messiah of Israel is depicted. The text begins with the Holy of Holies, this sacred room where only one person, the high priest, and only once a year on Yom Kippur could enter into it. There stood the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was a square box over which bowed 2 carved golden angels. The Ark contained the 10 Commandments, and the cover itself is called kaporet, which means atonement. It is from the sacred room, the Holy of Holies, where the Lord spoke to Israel. From there, they received the reconciliation or atonement and the commandment. This divine message flowed out through the rest of the Mishkan. And as we move into the holy place, the first item mentioned actually is the table of the 12 breads. There is one bread for each tribe of Israel. These loaves were called the bread of the presence, panim lechem, and so it was to be unleavened, as was every sacrifice offered to God. Leaven, being a symbol of sin, had to be absent. It begins small leaven, but grows to affect the whole lump. So these unleavened breads represented God's provision for Israel as they never lacked food in the wilderness. And there was a great miracle actually attached to these breads. Every Shabbat, the priest changed these loaves, these 12 loaves, for new ones. And they were ordered to eat the old bread, the one which would usually get stale and hard and even perhaps moldy after 7 days of sitting in the tent. But we see that these lechem, these breads, which stand in front of God before his presence, always kept their freshness, and as if it was just baked. These lechems then not only represent the Lord's constant provision for the 12 tribes, but teaches that being always close to God, there's no decay, but a constant renewing of our mind. He is the source of freshness. Furthermore, these 12 breads reminds us of the soon coming supper of the Lamb upon Yeshua's return, which will inaugurate our eternal Shabbat. As I just mentioned, this table of showbread is the first item mentioned after the ark, as if it tells us that God is so eagerly waiting for this time when we will all delight of this great meal as soon as we come into our eternal abode. And see that the table of showbread, like the Ark of the Covenant as well, as many other parts of the Mishkan, were made of wood covered with metal, here covered with gold. Why is that? These point to the nature and work of the Messiah. Micah the prophet tells us that he comes from above, even though he was born in Bethlehem, but he's coming from eternity, Olam, from Kedem. So here in the Mishkan we see his 2 origins, gold for heaven, wood for the earth. And following the order of the text, we now come to the menorah. This is made from one piece of gold, and it represents the light of God. It represents the Shekinah glory. The word menorah comes from the Hebrew word ner, meaning light, the light of God, the light which every believer is asked to share in the world around. But this very light of God is at its core the election of Israel. This is what it represents. Israel was called to be a light to the nations, as we read in Isaiah 42. A prediction yet to be fulfilled in the Messianic times. The menorah itself contains 7 branches, 7 being the number of perfection of testimony concerning divine truth. There are 6 branches plus 1 in the center. 6 is the number of man, that is, 1 is the number of God. The menorah represents God's partnership with God, with man, that is, as you go out to share his word. And the word tamid, because the center light was always lit. So it was called Tamid. It was an eternal light. It was always there. And every morning, boker by boker, the high priest or the priest will come, one priest, and then take the light from the center and light each and every one, as we need, of course, the light of God every single day. And after this, we're brought to consider the covering of the tent, of the Mishkan. This is beautiful, by the way. You know, there are 4 coverings, one on top of the other, so that only the first and the last covering were in view. However, these by themselves relate the history of redemption. The first, the inside one, was gorgeous. It was made of fine, expensive linen embroidered with cherubim, and its colors were blue, purple, and scarlet. This symbolized the angelic presence and ministry as they are there in heaven, always worshiping God. But how did the Mishkan look from the outside? The outer covering was made of animal skin, one that, according to the ancient rabbis, we can no longer name, since knowledge of it has been lost. However, we do have a good idea of the type of skin that it was. The Hebrew name for the skin is tachash, and Ezekiel, the prophet, tells us that they used it to make sandals. So it was an ordinary skin. So from the outside covering, we see the Messiah from the outside. As Isaiah tells us, there's no beauty as we should desire him, that we should desire him. For he was despised and he was rejected. But once you lift up the outer covering, we discover another one made of a ram's skin dyed in red. This is striking because it symbolizes his terumah, his offering that he made for our salvation. Then we have the third covering, another simple but beautiful ram's skin, again reminding us of Abraham and how the Lord would provide the lamb. And after the curtains of the Mishkan, the story of redemption ends with the altar of sacrifice. This is the first item we see when entering the whole perimeter of the Mishkan. But before reaching the presence of God, there stood a huge altar, which today teaches that the only way into the presence of God is by the way of a sacrifice. And so I ask the question, what is your sacrifice? What is your password to get into the presence of God? In the passage concerning the servant of the Lord, in Isaiah 53, the Messiah himself is said to have rendered himself as the Hasham. Hasham, that is the first and necessary sacrifice which allowed any Israelite to enter, to be able to do a first step into the presence of God. The Messiah of Israel is the Hasham of the Mishkan, allowing us to perform our Terumah. He is there always for anyone who would want to come to God, and his name is Yeshua, meaning salvation. The Messiah then covered all the requirement for anyone to approach the presence of God. May the Lord bless you all.